Good afternoon. Welcome to our program today entitled Key Safety and Security, both Physical and Financial Risk Management Strategies for U.S.-based Nonprofits Operating Overseas. My name is Jeff Tenenbaum, Chair of the Nonprofit Organizations Practice here at the Venable Law Firm, and this program is part of the monthly series that we do here at Venable on a wide variety of different nonprofit legal issues. Today's program is co-sponsored with a very special partner of ours, Humentum, formerly Inside NGO, and we're very pleased that Humentum is joining us in co-sponsoring today's program. We have a nice crowd here in our DC office joining us for lunch, and we have over 200 folks who have registered and are participating by our video webinar across the country today. Today's program is being recorded, as all of ours for the last 6 years are, and will be available tomorrow on our nonprofit YouTube channel, a link to which is on the last slide of today's PowerPoint presentation. All of you tomorrow will receive an email that contains a link to the recording of today's program, along with the PowerPoint slides and full speaker bios. And those of you in the room have a printed booklet that has a copy of the PowerPoint slides and our speaker bios. Those of you on the webinar, that document is linked in the confirmation email that you received this morning. For those of you in the Trade and Professional Association community, these programs are eligible for CAE Continuing Education credit. Preview of our upcoming programs. Next month, early next month, we have a terrific program entitled Performance Management, Getting the Best Out of Your Nonprofit's Workforce. We already have a huge number of folks who have registered for that program, both in person and on the webinar, and we're very excited about that one. To kick off next year on January 18th, our program is entitled The Top Privacy and Data Security Trends and Issues for Nonprofits in 2018. And on February 15th, our program is entitled Nonprofit Mergers, Alliances, and Joint Ventures, Options, Best Practices, and Practical Tips. We have other terrific programs in the works for next spring and beyond. In terms of logistics for today, for those of you in the room, feel free to ask questions at any time. Just raise your hand and please wait for one of the microphones to come to you so everyone on the webinar can hear and see you asking your questions. For those of you in the webinar, please pose your questions to me using the chat feature of the webinar software, and I will pose those to our speakers at the appropriate time. Before we do full introductions of our speakers, I want to introduce Marie McNamee, Director of Program and Member Services from Humentum, who is here to say a few words. Marie.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a really pleasure to be here, especially on such a topic. For those of you who read the description of the session, you can certainly tell that nonprofits operating overseas are faced with an increasing greater number of risks than just even a few years ago. We do see an increasing number of natural and man-made disasters, the rise of cyber attacks, the vulnerability of the NGO worker, and the growing sophistication of fraudulent schemes by actors targeting the sector. These are just a few illustrative examples of the critical importance for every organization to have risk management strategies in place that are incorporated not only into daily operations, but that are embraced by the organizational culture. Addressing safety and security of both people and financial assets must be approached from a holistic standpoint. And we're really pleased today and excited to join with Venable to have such an esteemed panel, including Nana Frimpong from Social Impact, who is an Inside NGO Now Humentum 2017 Operational Excellence Award winner. Michael ONeil, for anybody in the room and those on the call, certainly may recognize him as his long-standing contributions to the sector as a leader on safety and security, both as his time in Peace Corps, his tenure at Save the Children, and his ongoing role at the International NGO Safety and Security Association. And Jean-Michel Farrar from Ancora Consulting, who has extensive global experience in fraud and corruption investigations and providing compliance solutions. So certainly we have a great panel, a great topic, and thanks to Venable in co-sponsoring with Humentum. Jeff, back to you.
Thank you, Marie. I'm going to give some brief introductions of our speakers, and then we'll get our program started. You can see their full speaker bios in your handouts. First, to my immediate left is Michael ONeil. Michael is President and CEO of ONeil Paragon Solutions, and as Marie said, formerly with the Peace Corps and Save the Children International. He also serves as Vice Chair of the International NGO Safety and Security Association. Michael takes responsibility for helping to build organizational capabilities to meet current and future safety and security challenges. He's a highly respected professional in the field and viewed as a true leader in the international NGO safety and security management sector. To Michael's left is Jean-Michel Ferrat. Jean-Michel is Senior Managing Director, White Collar and Anti-Corruption Investigations and Compliance at the Ankara Consulting Group. Jean-Michel has over 20 years experience in the specialized fields of forensic accounting, fraud detection, and data analytics. He has applied his skills in a variety of cases involving corruption, kickbacks, collusive bidding rings, money laundering, embezzlement, asset misappropriation, terrorist financing, and financial statement fraud. I remember the first time that Jean-Michel and I went to lunch. He has some pretty fun and incredible war stories to tell from his time in the field, which continues to this day. He's led or participated in reactive investigations and proactive compliance engagement, including Foreign Corrupt Practices Act monitorships across the U.S. and over 25 countries around the world. And last but not least, to Jean-Michel's left is Nana Frimpong. Nana is Director of Business Operations and Security Services at Social Impact. There, he oversees the coordinated development, implementation, and continuous improvement of Social Impact's business management systems. Prior to joining Social Impact, Nana worked at Population Services International and ran mid to large-scale social marketing programs that promoted family planning and the prevention and treatment of malaria, HIV/AIDS, and other diseases. During his tenure at PSI, he served as country director in Angola and later South Sudan, where he oversaw the implementation of one of the largest integrated community case management programs in the history of that country. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to get us started. Michael?
Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone, and to those online also. I just want to start by saying I appreciate this opportunity, and I'm recognizing several colleagues, former colleagues, business affiliates in the audience, and I appreciate your attention. I think it's indicative that the number of people here and online reflects how important this topic is. ONeil Paragon Solutions, as you can see there, was established a couple of years ago. We focus on duty of care, review and support for NGOs. We tend to support those that cannot afford full-time security risk managers and help them navigate to get the best possible systems in place that are pragmatic and effective to support their staff and meet their duty of care responsibilities. We also help with critical incident preparation, planning, training, and response, and help develop safety and security risk systems and leadership and executive training for various kinds of organizations. The history of duty of care as it applies to the NGO and how it links to safety and security risk management goes back to the early 90s or so. And at that time, around 1996-97, globally there were probably three directors of global safety and security across the NGO community. Today there's over 100. And the precipitating causes tended to be linked to the Rwanda genocide and the way that humanitarians were largely out-hustled and outmaneuvered by the very people who were causing the genocide and had to do business with them in order to access vulnerable populations. Second key event was the murder of 5 ICRC delegates in Chechnya. This was a clarion call to the NGOs that it was not business as usual. We need to get our act together in order to be more mature and more systematic and strategic about the way we thought about security management. Over time, security management evolved, and there was a major set of trainings that resulted in the book GPR 8, Good Practice Review 8 from the Humanitarian Practice Network that came out in 2000 called Operational Security Risk Management and Operational Environments. It's a seminal text for security management for NGOs. that introduced into the lexicon of security risk management the idea of acceptance, which has taken on a bit of a core function within many NGOs, acceptance being a relationship-oriented, context, analytical approach to negotiating access to vulnerable populations that oftentimes augments a protective or deterrent approach to security management in NGOs. With the emergence of ISO 31000 on risk management, safety and security management became enveloped in the safety and security risk management context, and that has introduced a whole other concept and operational approach to safety and security risk management. Over the last couple years or so, this then has been subsumed under duty of care. They're not a total perfect fit, but duty of care is really where safety and security risk management sits in many organizations. And it's largely to do with making sure that the employers understand the foreseeable risks that exist in the operational areas where they are sending their employees and put in place reasonable measures. This is a legal, moral, ethical responsibility that the leadership of organizations have to their employees, whether it's under OSHA type of safety and security, safety regulations, or under the Manslaughter Act in the UK that holds senior managers accountable if something happens to their staff overseas and the organization is found to be negligent in that case. There have been a couple of court cases that have emerged recently that have now put in place precedent of how organizations may or may not be held accountable for what they do or do not do in meeting their duty of care responsibilities to their employees. So, what goes into meeting this duty of care responsibility? I've framed it out in 6 categories: leadership commitment, policy statements, and procedures that go with that, assessing risks, mitigating risks, holding everyone, including individuals, accountable, and duty of loyalty. And I'll say more about each of these individually. What I'm going to set out is more of a kind of a systems framework of what it looks like when all these components are in place. Nana will explain more about the operationalizing some of this, and Jean-Michel will talk more about the financial risk management that underlies all of this. And so you'll see how this flows from one speaker to the next. We came out with this statement, and I'll just read it because I think it hits on a lot of things that will resonate throughout the other presentation today. First of all, that leadership is committed to creating a culture of effective and pragmatic risk management across the organization that meets our responsibilities to all staff by establishing reasonable, sustainable measures to mitigate recognized risks, by integrating risk management principles into program design and delivery, by empowering our staff to take responsible decisions through a better understanding of the complex environments in which we operate, and by investing sufficient resources to develop innovative tools and systems that minimize risk to staff while maximizing the impact of our programs. And that's a bit of a mouthful, but if you break it down to its various components, you can see that it's chock full of value-based sentences and concepts. And it sort of holds together a bit if you take it and reintegrate it after you break it down to understand it. What it doesn't say is the responsibility of an organization to keep its staff safe. And this is a debate that goes on in the security risk management field all the time. If you want to keep people safe, then you become somewhat risk-averse as an organization. There's some research that suggests that the more formalized the security risk management becomes in an organization, the more risk-averse that organization becomes. I would rather put it that the function of an effective safety and security risk management system is to ensure access to vulnerable populations while mitigating the risks in doing so. You know, we all have our missions and we all have a reason why we're out there exposing our staff to risk. And the understanding is that we're not going to alleviate all risk, but we need to manage it wisely. So assessing risk, in order to understand the risk, you have to have a formal risk assessment in place somehow. Some people try to subcontract this out to risk assessment providers or threat assessment providers. Ultimately, though, while The external threat analysis can be done externally. Internally, you have to look at your own operations, your own people, your own culture to determine what your own vulnerability is in order to design and implement reasonable risk mitigation measures. And the balance here has to be struck that, you know, your risk mitigation measures can't be so onerous and so draconian that it's stopping people from doing their jobs. And so there's got to be some negotiation that goes on here with your program people. So operations and administration, security and programming, compliance and risk management all have to be around the table to come up with these effective and pragmatic strategies. The assessments need to be done by people who are qualified. If I look at some of the lawsuits that have been put out there, not all of them have gone to court, but the statements are out there. The questions oftentimes raised are, what was the qualification of the person that did the risk assessment on which the decisions of the board were made? And so it's important that, you know, it's just not somebody out there who looked around and said, oh, yeah, here's what it is, we'll give it a number and a color and call it a day. There's got to be a bit of a more formalized and checks and balances on how these things are done. Risk ratings have to be done by location, not just countrywide. I mean, if you look at a country like Mali or Niger, the north of the country is significantly different from a threat rating than what you would find, let's say, in the capital city or in the south of the country. And if this is where your program operations are, your risk assessment has to be linked to the program operational area. I already mentioned that organizational vulnerability was actually critical too. And this is your profile, who you are, what you're doing. If you're doing humanitarian work or development work, that's going to be a bit different than if you're doing advocacy or rights-based work or rescuing people who are being abused by the police or going up against policies of corruption. I mean, this analysis that you do has to be predicated on what is it, the work you're doing and the exposure that your staff have to the risks that you've identified. The other thing is both the work of the organization, its size, its type of programs, its activities, its personnel do not remain static, nor does the context in which you're operating. And so the assessments have to be a continuous process that reflects the dynamism of the environment and the organization itself. So doing a risk assessment or making a decision based on a risk assessment that occurred a year ago is sometimes not going to be valid. In certain cases, it might be if there's stability within your operations and stability within the context, but it's largely a dynamic process out there. If you're going into a disaster response, that a quick onset disaster, let's say in an area, Puerto Rico, for instance, or Houston, an assessment needs to be done about what has changed now because of this quick onset disaster that's going to affect the well-being of the staff and the ability for them to access vulnerable populations. And it has to be contemporary to the time of the big event that has precipitated the response. So mitigating risk is really what the meat of all of this is all about, right? Once you understand what the situation is and what you're striving to do in this context, then it's important to put in place clear, concise, effective, and pragmatic policies and procedures. And again, this is a consultative process that has to take in the realities of trying to deliver programs in fairly complex and variable environments. And because of a policy is overarching for the whole organization, it has to be broad enough to cover all these various contexts and eventualities. So it tends to be that the policies fall back on key principles. And this is what's critical to an organization is be clear about what your principles are. What are your core values? And your policies will stem from that. The procedures then are what are the steps that need to be taken to meet the policy expectations. And then after procedures, you also have guidelines, you have tools, and then this might be done in a certain kind of framework, and then it has to be documented, it has to be communicated, it has to be trained to. I mean, it's a whole system here. The concept of informed consent is part of a process of letting the people who are being deployed understand what the risks are in the activities that they're undertaking in the place that they're undertaking them, letting them know what the mitigation measures are that they are expected to meet and comply with and what the organization has in place to deal with the risk, and essentially that they're agreeing to abide by the organizational expectations, codes of conduct, policies, procedures, things of that nature. And I think, for myself, that the best thing is to have this as a signed document. You know, after your induction or your briefing prior to departure, You basically say, hey, I know what the risks are. I know what's expected of me. I agree to abide by the policies and procedures of the organization. I sign it, and the person who did the induction signs it. It goes into a file. I mean, from a legal perspective, it gives some cover to the organization, but it's also a way of systematizing and ensuring these things are being implemented appropriately and not just written down on paper. A paper plan is not a useful tool, right? The largest risk for many organizations occurred while people are traveling. So travel planning, tracking, and support is absolutely critical in assessing your own vulnerability and where you can get the biggest bang for the buck, really, with regard to duty of care with your employees. You know, how are trips authorized? How is information given to travelers pre-departure about their destination and what risks they might face while they're there? What mitigation measures are in place? How do you track travelers so that if something happens in the environment where you expect them to be, that you can locate them and contact them and give them guidance? How do you support them? Do you have a 24/7 number? Is that an in-house thing where somebody carries a bag around with a telephone? And if so, are the procedures? Are these people trained? Is it 24/7? What are the protocols if somebody actually makes that call? Have you tested it? There are outsourced private sector consultancies to provide this service. If you're doing that, then you have to make sure that they understand who they need to call. Their job is not to do the problem solving. Their job is to receive the calls, determine what the issues are, and direct the calls to the appropriate people. But you got to work to make this happen. It's just not a matter of just paying a monthly premium. The next is the whole safety and security.
Michael, before you go on to the next one, we have a question from the webinar that says, you're referring to risk assessments needing to be done by qualified people, whether they're on staff or outsourced consultants. And the questioner asks, is reliance on ISO ratings reasonable? And if not, how else do you gauge qualifications?
Yeah, that's a good question. The ISO ratings and the whole security risk management matrix, which I didn't present here because it gets a little bit too much into the weeds here, is the standard that's out there. And so following the generally identifying the threat, rating it as high, medium, low, determining what is the likelihood that it occurs, what's the impact should it occur, and trying to measure each of the mitigating measures and how it either affects the likelihood or the impact. That's sort of the standard process. There are, I'm happy to say that INSA is actually on the cusp of releasing a certification program for country-level security risk managers that will codify the risk assessment process related directly to ISO 31000. Our hope is that this will give confidence to employers and to the security risk managers themselves that there's a constancy of application of approach. And ultimately, I think that will normalize and give some clarity to that very point. The safety and security risk management system, I'm not going to say too much about it because Nana, I think, is going into greater detail about it. But it looks at physical security, information security, personnel security, training, the integration of security risk management with programs, incident reporting, and critical incident management, which you see as the next one. So that's an extraordinary piece. So as part of understanding what the potential risks are, and you know what's foreseeable, organizations need to have a response capacity in there. We cannot pretend like a car accident or a road traffic crash is not going to occur in the field. So we have to have mitigating measures, and we have to have a critical incident management approach to that. Medevacs, detention, kidnappings, death of a staff member. All of these things are fairly predictable or foreseeable, let me say, and therefore should have extraordinary protocols built around it. In addition, for those that rise to a very high level, perhaps even existential to the organization, a crisis management team and plan specific for those kinds of events is highly advisable. Having it managed by your senior management team is sometimes counterproductive because it then sucks all the leadership into operating and managing the crisis and doesn't allow them to maintain operational command of the day-to-day operations of the organization. For some small organizations, they have no choice because they have limited senior staff, but for large and more complex organizations, isolating the crisis, the critical event and the management of the incident to a crisis management team of some kind is the norm and is highly advisable, and that allows the organization to continue on with its operational activities. Training goes to competencies. For each of these functions that we have here, whether it's planning or management or crisis management, there are competencies that need to be trained to so that the people taking on these responsibilities have the skill sets and the competency to do their jobs effectively. If that's for travelers, then that's traveler training. And some organizations have a basic training for all travelers and a hostile environment, advanced training, heat training for those going to more complex and secure environments. There's training for doing risk assessments, for instance, for your people on the ground who are doing risk assessments. There's hostage survival training if you're posting people in places in the top 10 countries for kidnapping, things of that nature. And I don't want to ignore here staff wellness and support. Our people are our greatest resource, and making sure that they are regularly and consistently supported in their efforts is absolutely critical, and it's part of the duty of care responsibilities of the organization. Furthermore, it goes directly to their productivity and achieving mission objectives, and also to behavioral issues that go to security and insecurity in the field. It's a win-win-win situation to have a pretty strong formalized staff wellness and support program. And in as much as most organizations have employee assistance programs, EAPs, that deal with more North American type stressors in the workplace, I would suggest that if you have large overseas presence or you're dealing in complex environments like in conflict or disasters, you might want to look at some extraordinary staff support capacity within your organization or outsource to a consulting group or somebody, private provider, to make sure that if there's primary trauma or secondary trauma, that we can address this right away. Go ahead.
Michael, question from the webinar. Do you have any suggestions for best practices around limiting liability and or getting informed consent when sending donors or guests out to the field for site visits?
Yes. Okay. So just let me give one more bullet point. It's not on the slide. I neglected to put that in there, and that's insurance. And insurance is really a key step into mitigating risk to the organization. But an insurance policy alone will not mitigate all your risk. The insurance policies, in a way, reimburse you for the actions that you're taking. That presumes that you're going to be taking some actions that are going to have some cost. All those actions are what all the other mitigating risks are on there. So the insurance companies helps, and that relationship with your insurance company is important because together you can look at the same situation through different lenses before a critical incident occurs. And your insurance agent or your insurance broker is a critical ally in helping to develop an appropriate risk mitigation strategy. As to donors or volunteers or others going to the field, I would suggest that there's, duty of care still lies with the organization, right? There's others in the room of a legal persuasion who might be able to fine-tune this a little bit. But in my experience, if they're traveling under your auspices to the field, then their expectation, and I think a reasonable person would expect that you will make sure that if something happens, that their situation is going to be managed within the organization. That being the case, then what is the expectation on what they need to do to meet your requirements for travel? We've had this debate in organizations all along. Should donors, if traveling to Iraq, have to go through the 3-hour online security training course? I'd say yes. I'd say that's a responsible thing for an organization to do. Yeah, but their time is valuable. Okay, I get that, right? But so is the time of the valuable of all our employees, but we do it as a matter of duty of care. And the one thing you don't want to do is have a regret at the end of the day that for the sake of 3 hours, somebody stumbled into a situation that they couldn't handle, and it reflects poorly on the organization and affects your reputation. Right? I think that has to be negotiated with high-level people to say, hey, look, really as a donor or a supporter of the organization, understand how we do things that we do in the places that we do them. This is what we require of everybody. We invite you along. There's a way that you can present a lot of different things. You can make it a compliance, you have to do this, or you can kind of invite people in to say, hey, look, if I were to provide this training to you off the shelf, it would cost you $2,000. I'm giving it to you for free. I mean, there's a different way to present this. And I know that's a little bit offhanded, but, I've been in these dialogues, and I think it's important that we demonstrate to our donors and our volunteers that we do take this seriously. And I think it pays dividends later on, even though it may at some point be an inconvenience for somebody up front. Now, of course, that depends on what they're going there to do, right? I mean, if they're just going to the capital city to attend a conference, maybe they don't have to go through all the training and requirements for travelers that are going into the field and going out into the border areas where the conflict is or something like that. No matter what it is, if you're having an event that you're sending donors or volunteers to, you still as an organization should be assessing what the risk is for that particular person in that particular event and putting, again, in place reasonable measures and making sure that they're apprised of this and that they're briefed on it and that they have an informed consent. It may not look exactly the same, but the process is the same. Okay. Excellent question. Good question. Accountability. At the end of the day, you can't just write things down. And I think Jean-Michel is going to talk a bit about accountability here. Accountability means that everyone has to be held accountable for what is it they are expected to do, whether it's to perform a service or do an activity or to comply with regulations and activities that are expected of them as an organization. So the accountability piece is that it's, the skill sets and the ability should be competency-based. So it has to be measurable or tangible or observable. It has to be invested in people's job descriptions. If I go to an organization, I'm doing an assessment, and they tell me that the main risk is managed by the country director, safety and security risk management is the country director's responsibility. And you look at the country director's job description, and it's not in there, they're not being hired for it, they're not being trained to it, they're not being compensated for it, and I'm guessing they're not being held accountable to it. And as a person doing an analysis, I would suggest that either you make this clear in the job description or you find somebody in the country office who has this as their primary responsibility. Obviously, the country director has global responsibility for everything that happens in the country office, but where is the accountability built in, right? And it's, I would say, job descriptions and performance appraisals, rewards and sanctions. If somebody does a good job, you give them a meritorious increase, you give them a reward, you give them a bonus. If they don't, you give them a demerit or whatever the sanction is within your organization. And the other part of this is to document all of this. There has to be clear documentation. Doing this kind of offhand, organically within an organization makes it rather ad hoc. I'm coming to the end of my presentation, but I just want to leave you with when I was the director of security at the Peace Corps, we were audited by the General Accounting Office. And it was a pretty extreme, it's a deep audit. They were really looking on, how Peace Corps managed safety and security for volunteers. And their key question that they always came back to was, how do you know, so I was the director of security, how do you know as a director of security that your policies and procedures are being implemented on the ground? And saying that you trust your country directors is not enough. It's just not enough. Yeah, you got to be able to verify, and you have to be able to account for how this is being implemented. I think I have one more. So duty of loyalty, in summary, is your employees embracing the organizational values and customs and culture and abiding by the policies and procedures and meeting the expectations, abiding by the code of conduct, so that they are part of the solution and that you're seeing this as a reflexive duty of care, duty of loyalty relationship. And again, I would suggest that building this into the value proposition of your organization, our mission is to ... In order to do this, we need to have a duty of care to the employees so that we understand what are the foreseeable risks and put in place reasonable measures. And you as the employees need to work with us to comply with our procedures, give us feedback, report incidents, et cetera, et cetera. in this way, then you have a more of a cultural approach to meeting the risks and meeting your duty of care responsibilities. Thank you.
And Michael, before we move on, or this question could be for you and it may be even more appropriate for John Michel, but we had a question about, so the cost of everything that you've described of kind of creating and implementing and training in connection with safety and security programs. In your experience with most federally funded programs, federal grants and cooperative agreements, for instance, are these costs allowed to be charged to direct program costs, or are these generally considered indirect costs?
That's a great question, and it's been a debate that's going on. So I would say there's a couple things. One is there are costs that go to employee engagement that probably go to overhead of an organization. I would also say that if we frame global safety and security risk management as ensuring access to vulnerable populations while managing risk, then far more of it is under program costs than it is under security costs. If, on the other hand, you say, oh, our job is to keep our staff safe, then almost everything you do is going to be overhead. So, and it's not just a word game. It's a conceptual change of view. The objective is not to keep people safe. The objective is to manage risk in order to deliver services to vulnerable populations. And if you come at it that way, far more clarity comes into what's budgeted for the field versus what goes in the overhead. And I know that that undesignated fund and that overhead 10% magic number are really critical obstacles sometimes to putting this stuff in place. I will also say that you can find some savings and efficiencies in alliances and partnerships and in dovetailing some of the things that are in systems that already exist within your organization.
So based on what you just said, do you have any kind of proactive, kind of prophylactic tips for international NGOs of kind of ways to dress up some of these programs and expenditures? You know, we do this all the time in the legal area. Say if you kind of put the proper envelope around something and dress it up in a certain way, at least it gives you a stronger argument that you can treat it as this or that for tax purposes or other things. So here, if you do want to treat it as direct program costs, and I know a lot of our clients do, what are some practical tips? Okay, so one it would be your context analysis, your stakeholder analysis, and your needs assessments can all be done jointly. It's the same trip. So your security risk person, your security focal point, your program person, your community engagement person, go to the field together and not do stovepiped, siloed assessments. You do one assessment. First of all, it's easier for the community not to be poked and prodded by 3 different teams coming in asking similar questions. But it also looks at it as a more integrated approach to development as a whole. So that's one right there. Another one is all the safety equipment and driver training that needs to be done could be put into the purchase cost of the vehicle. So if your Land Cruiser costs $35,000, add another $2,000 or something and make sure you get the first aid kit, the shovels, the traffic triangles, to add $50 per vehicle for driver training or something like that. Donors tend to be, I would say it this way, right? If you do your risk assessment and you do it in the way I suggested, integrated with your needs assessment and community context analysis, that risk matrix, then here's all the possible risks that will undermine our delivering the successful program. Here are the mitigation measures that we're going to use to make it more likely that we will succeed. Each one of these mitigation measures technically is program delivery. And it's the way you frame the narrative, as you say, put the envelope around it. The donors, at least the main donors, DFID, USAID, CETA in Sweden, they are on board with this. If you can if you can put it in this context and put it forward this way, a lot of the field level activities that ordinarily would be safety and security, framed in this way, tend to be risk mitigation strategies. What's the ultimate risk is that the program will fail. That's the ultimate risk. And if you put it in that way, that this is program success that we're talking about, it's more likely that it will be funded. Terrific. Thank you very much. And thanks for a great presentation. Jean-Michel?
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. In the spirit of time, I'm going to be as quick as I can here. I know everybody loves talking about accounting, so I'm going to have to disappoint you and be brief. Just a little bit of context and background on my own experience. I'm a CPA and have focused my career largely on fraud and corruption issues, both from a reactive investigations perspective and a compliance perspective. So a lot of what we learned in actual investigations we can then apply in terms of buttoning up controls from a proactive perspective. I was one of the lead forensic accountants on the UN Iraq oil for food investigation. Spent about 3 or 4 years with as a consultant to the Integrity Vice Presidency at the World Bank, and investigated a lot of programs implemented with World Bank funds, and spent an equally large amount of time at the Global Fund, assisting the Office of the Inspector General in executing their investigations of fraud and corruption around the world. After a 3 or 4 year period of not doing work for the Global Fund, they asked that I become an independent member on the Audit and Finance Committee. So I currently sit on the Audit and Finance Committee of the Board of Directors of the Global Fund, and I'm the forensic accounting expert advising the Audit Committee. I've also done work for much smaller NGOs as well, and I know we have a sort of a broad representation here of large and small. So I've assisted a number of smaller NGOs in investigating misappropriations and helping them button up controls. So with that said, I have just really a few examples, and there are many. But some of the things that I've seen during the course of my career that are schemes, issues from a financial perspective that plague NGOs operating internationally. The first, which is probably the most prevalent, is bad procurements, right? So steering awards, steering tenders to particular individuals, overpriced tenders which provide a padding for the ability to pay a kickback or bribe or some other sort of fraudulent payment. Just straight misappropriations from bank accounts, either from bank accounts or from petty cash. The use of just fraudulent vendors, fraudulent third parties, to which payments are made. And then the fictitious service delivery. So, really what we're looking at is two angles of fraud or corruption when we look at international development programs. There's either an overpricing, which allows for that fraudulent piece, or there's an underdelivery, right? You're paying the right price, but you're getting a lot less than what you originally paid for. So in the delivery space, what we've seen frequently as an example is around training. So having NGOs go out and train, let's say in the health sector, train a bunch of local doctors or nurses or other health sector people. And what we have found in instances are rates of 50, 60, 70% of fake people on those lists. So the payments for per diems and lunches and hotels and all that stuff. Some of you guys are shaking or nodding your heads. You've all seen this. But these things keep occurring and keep coming back. And then product diversion. So for programs that are actually delivering goods, let's think of the most recent in Syria, the Syria refugee crisis, winter kits, health kits that are being purchased either above market value. They're being purchased with product replacement issues where the kits actually don't include the types and quality of products that were originally contracted for. And then ultimately they just sort of evaporate and end up on the black market. In the health sector, there have been, a number of issues around LLINs, the bed nets for malaria, showing up in the black market. Obviously, drugs as well. Why is this happening? I think is obviously the important question, and what can be done to try to mitigate some of these risks. The biggest thing that I see, and I see this in the private sector as well as in the public sector in the NGO world, it's the fact that the systems that are housing the information around program delivery and the financial components in particular are decentralized, typically. And the visibility that the HQ operations, be it the program folks, the finance folks who usually I'm interfacing with, the visibility that those folks have into what's going on in the field is oftentimes limited. And that's really a function of the fact that most NGOs are operating in very spread geographic locations. They're responding to things. So if we think about Syria, for example, an NGO has to pop up an office in Turkey, in the south of Turkey. The likelihood of them spinning up an instance of their SAP system or their cost point, their Deltek system at that newly established project location is pretty slim. So what happens? The accounting, all the back office stuff is done on a spreadsheet or is done in Access, and then is somehow sort of funneled up to HQ. The second biggest issue, and it ties into the first, is there's typically very little visibility, again, at the central level as to who is receiving payments out in the field. All right. Now, whether those be actual end user beneficiaries, individuals that may be getting some kind of stipend, that may be getting some kind of good, to the larger ticket items, so third-party vendors that are providing goods or providing services, right? And if you're sitting in New York City or you're sitting in Atlanta or in DC as a finance person, let's say you're the controller, you rarely, from what I've seen, have the ability to say, I'm curious as to who we're paying in our Iraq program or who we're paying in our Syria program. And having that information available at that central location is usually pretty rare. The lack of visibility, as I said before, into procurements, I think, is an important issue as well. The vast majority of the fraud that we see in the larger scale fraud happens at the procurement level. So the ability, again, for someone holistically to say, we have had X number of large procurements or X number of procurements in this particular part of the world. Here's how many bidders we had. Here's how many losers we had. Who were the losers? Do we know sort of how the bid evaluation committee evaluated these bids, right? All of those things are really pushed down to the local level. Some folks do it well, other people don't, but it's very difficult to get that sort of holistic view.
Jean-Michel, before you move on, so we get this a lot from our clients. In theory, obviously you want to try to do all these things. You want to try to get as many bids as possible and document who the bidders are and do your due diligence and everything else in the procurement process. But as we know, in certain parts of the world and in certain crisis situations, it's just extremely difficult, if not sometimes impossible, to do. So what's your answer to NGOs who say, this sounds great. We have no problem doing that in the States, but in some of these parts of the world and at certain times, it's just impossible.
Yeah, so let me clarify my point. My point is not that sole sources won't happen. They always will. For the exact point that you said, there aren't, in parts of the world, there aren't 3 vendors that will provide service X. What I'm suggesting, though, is that the fact that a sole source occurred for a particular size procurement is what should be reported at a central level. So if I'm a controller or I'm a compliance officer or I'm head of procurement or what have you, I would be interested to know that 90% of my largest procurements were done on a sole source basis. Okay. I might question that, and the answer may very well be this, we tried to find people to bid, we couldn't, here's our documentation. But it's the ability to see that information, I think, that's really critical. It's not the fact that information suggests that sole sources, are problematic. It's sort of the visibility into the process, I think, is the point.
And maybe one follow-up question. On our programs here, a couple of times we've had Laura Rousseau, who many of you know from USAID Inspector General's office, who's been one of the lead folks and who's spoken publicly about their investigation into the procurement fraud in connection with the Syrian refugee crisis, particularly in Turkey. And there's been a lot reported on that publicly. On the procurement process there and some of the reported abuses, any kind of lessons learned or tips or suggestions from that you might pass on to folks?
Yeah. So I was actually involved in some of that work for a particular NGO. in fact was in a far-flung location when I first reached out to Jeff on the basis of that particular webinar. And I think one of the lessons that became clear to me is exactly what I'm saying. It was very obvious to us when we looked at a particular set of procurements in this particular location that someone had visibility into who winning bidders were and who losing bidders were. Anyone could have figured out that there was a bid rotation scheme going on. And you didn't need all of the stack of RFPs and of tender documents. You didn't need all the pricing analysis. You really just needed to see, hey, there's 10 procurements. It's the same 6 companies bidding every single time, and you can sort of clearly see that pattern of bid rotation. So really not rocket science. But what is the challenge is how do you get that information from far-flung locations in a consistent and systematic way, right? How do you make it standardized across all of your locations so that someone could do that type of meaningful analysis? I think that's the real challenge. The last point I want to make, and this is it's very true in the private sector, and I think there are applications here as well in the NGO world. In the FCPA space, our main sort of regulators and law enforcement, being the SEC and the DOJ, and I'll go over this a little bit in a second. One of the hallmarks, as they say, of an effective compliance program is around monitoring and testing, and I'm going to talk more about that. And monitoring and testing is really about what are you doing to find stuff that slips through the cracks, right? So the idea of preventive controls, your segregation of duties, completing bank reconciliations, onboarding new vendors with the right sort of protocols, all that being preventive. You need to have protocols in place from a detective perspective. Things that don't work up here that you can sort of catch in that safety net on the back end. So hallmarks of an effective compliance program. I'm not going to go through these. They're not all on here. We heard Michael talk about tone at the top. That's obviously a key one. Risk assessment is on here. That's a key one. Your risk assessment should have a fraud and corruption risk. If you're a U.S. company operating overseas, that's one of the things that the DOJ and the SEC, if you're a public company, will look for. I think a lot of these, Michael has already talked about. We've talked a little bit about third parties. Around this area is really knowing who you're doing business with, right? So it's not enough to just to have a procurement process and say I've reached out to 3 firms. Well, you're going to engage a particular company to do, to provide a service. And as stewards of donor funds, I think one of the responsibilities is making sure we know who those third parties are. The one I want to talk about more, though, which is why it's highlighted in red, is the periodic testing. And this is really what I help organizations do. So let's assume we don't have this great ERP system that allows me as the controller to go over and click a couple buttons and figure out what's spent in Syria and figure out what's spent in Indonesia. Let's assume it's much more decentralized than that. I think there's certain things that one can do. What happens in most organizations, be they private sector or not, that face this situation, is they end up summarizing financial information in some consolidated way. Right. So the detailed operations of that Syria office, for example, will not be funneled up to headquarters. What will be funneled up is some higher level of information that can then be consolidated into a financial statement, right, to a donor statement. Some of that information that resides at that lower level is really critical in some of the stuff that I'm talking about. Okay. What are some of the compliance sensitive GL accounts happening down at the bottom? What are some of the real sensitive procurements that are happening down there that aren't being funneled up? That takes a little bit of a thought process by controllers, by CFOs, by compliance officers to say, what do we have right now, right, from a financial perspective, and what could we benefit from that we know is sitting down in someone's computer down in the field in some local accounting system, and is there a way to sort of standardize that? we talked about the procurement stuff a little bit already. You always want to be in a position where the local offices are adequately tracking to whom payments are being made. All right, that needs to be captured electronically. So the identity of third parties to whom payments are being made or individuals to whom payments are being made. That's information also that could be very valuable and bubbling up for red flag analysis and trends analysis. And so, yeah, so last one, red flags. What could we do with this? You know, some of the things that we've helped NGOs do is to think through, and in particular, these are NGOs in crisis, right? So we you know, are mainly coming in assisting organizations when something really bad has happened. You know, some of the things that we've helped implement are looking at that lowest level of data across the organizations and saying, how can we set up a protocol that these local level controllers or finance people are sending up the right information in a consistent way that will enable a red flag analysis, right? So what would a red flag analysis may be? Let's find this collusive activity in procurement, right? Let's find instances where we are paying a vendor to do work in Syria, but the bank, we're actually making a payment to Hong Kong or something. You know, those sorts of odd sort of payments. The last thing I'll leave you with, I think it's the last thing. The last thing I'll leave you with, sorry, the penultimate thing, is there seems to be really an over-reliance on internal audit in a lot of organizations that we come in and assess. And internal audit is great. Internal audit is typically extremely helpful to organizations. The problem with internal audit is they're typically resource constraints. More so, I think, in the NGO space than in the private sector space, for obvious reasons. And internal audit typically is not going to do deep dives into the types of issues that we're talking about here from a financial perspective. What we've found to be really effective is within the controllership, within the finance function, having an accountant with knowledge of data analytics, with knowledge of forensic procedures. You know, this is not somebody that needs 20 years of experience, but, you know, somebody coming out of a good public accounting firm that's done some investigations that can help devise these sorts of protocols, right? Somebody that has the experience to say, what kind of data is floating out there? How can we get it up and how can we analyze it in a way? Again, the goal here being, let's look at detective type procedures after the fact on a timely basis, right? You don't want it to happen a year later or 18 months later. You know, we're talking about on a monthly basis or even quicker than that, but setting up those protocols that the controller, compliance, whomever it might be, can then say, okay, this looks weird to me. Let me go to that office and ask for more clarification. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean-Michel. And last but not least, Nana.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nana Frimpong from Social Impact. What I'm going to do today is try to lend some sort of tangible examples to what Michael just talked about around how we went about setting up a safety and security risk management system at Social Impact. But sitting here listening to Jean-Michel speak, I couldn't help but relive some of my glory moments out in the field as a country representative and some of all the fun challenges that you have to experience with just running day-to-day operations. So what I'm going to try to do very quickly today is give you a brief sense of who we are, so as Social Impact and the type of work that we do. Talk a little bit about what the previous state of safety and security risk management was upon my arrival about 2 years ago. And then delve a little bit into the drivers of change and also a few things that, so, you know, were barriers to implementation, but we sort of transformed to opportunities. Yeah. So we're a little bit different from a number of folks, both online and in this room, in the sense that we don't typically implement development projects, but what we do is essentially evaluate them. So we do a lot of monitoring and evaluation work, assisting federal USAID missions and other federal agencies to evaluate work that has been done using funds that they've provided to organizations. We also do provide a lot of capacity building services to missions all over the world and support them in strategic planning activities as well. And this often means that our work is really split into two kinds of operations. So the first kind is essentially what was and has been our bread and butter, getting mobile teams all over the world to do these evaluations, performance evaluations, impact evaluations, and monitoring and learning sessions and seminars. And then the second element, which is a more recent development, is essentially having sort of offices that are situated in countries supporting missions with monitoring, evaluation, and learning components within very specific contracts. So as I had mentioned, a lot of our work involves teams, mobile teams of 4 to 5 people flying all over the place doing these assessments. Just to give you some examples, for 2016-2017 calendar year, we had about 650 trips with about 4 or 5 people on each trip, 236 travelers in total. And essentially the breakdown of destinations, ranges from Kazakhstan all the way to Thailand, Afghanistan all the way through to the DRC. So the risk is varied. It was also a little bit harder to control given that there's so many people all over the place at any given moment, as opposed to sort of the luxury of having a field office where you have X number of staff who may be traveling to fulfill a particular mission over a certain number of days over a certain time period. So when I arrived about 2 years ago, there was, in fact, an attempt at ensuring that we had some safety and security measures in place to protect the well-being of staff, and what I term now as enabled programming, right? However, it was very decentralized, and some very sort of essential pre-departure preparations just weren't happening in a consistent fashion. I recall instances where I would sort of wake up in the middle of the night and find out that somebody had traveled to a place in Uzbekistan and was just sending an email because, they just happened to not have, find a car that they could rent to use and were seeking advice. So we really didn't have a system in place for tracking staff that were going to be traveling in a consistent fashion. And I didn't really have any insight into who was booking trips when with our travel agency. The travel policy that was in place was a little bit outdated, and insurance management, which I consider a pretty significant component of risk management, was also scattered across multiple divisions and departments within the company. So what did we do? Essentially, my first job was to set about thinking through where the major risks sort of existed, and then trying to just document them all, bringing them together to present to senior management. Looking at what the biggest driver of risk for the company was very easy because it had to be travel. We were sending tons of people out on a pretty regular basis, and that for me was going to be my point of entry as to the number of things that it touches on, because travel touches on your physical security, it touches on information security, it touches on financial security because you have teams running around with cash or cards, renting and engaging in transactions with third parties. So you can touch on some of these like procurement issues that come along with that. And then really taking that information and presenting it in a way that made it tangible to senior management. When I joined, I wasn't originally on the senior management team, so that made it a little bit more sort of difficult. But in sort of a tribute to what Michael said, the chief operating officer that I reported to directly was a key ally in the sense that she saw the need for having a much more robust travel safety and security policy in place, ensuring that we were managing and mitigating risk in a much more proactive way. And so I essentially hitched my wagon to hers and used her as the conduit to the senior management to gain sort of access to just present what I had seen as some risks and what my thinking was around how we mitigated them. So that particular conversation or series of conversations led to us putting together a basic working group that would look at some of these issues and try to determine what our appetite for risk was as a company. There was obviously some concern around all these conversations about risk mitigation and risk management and what it would mean for programming. Does that mean we're not going to be able to travel to certain places? Are we now going to slow down our ability to be responsive in countries that are not necessarily, garden spots? And so the way this working group worked was really to try to harmonize approaches and also dispel any notions of skepticism that may exist as a result of just a lack of information or understanding of what was actually going to be put in place to help ensure that we were mitigating risk as a company. The working group sort of activities generated an operational plan where we highlighted very sort of crisply what the key issues and areas were that we were going to address in an iterative fashion, because we don't have unlimited resources, just like many of you, and so priorities had to be sort of the order of the day. But one of my first and sort of important things that I insisted on in these meetings was hiring an expert. Because while I had lived and worked in many places that, many people would not consider vacation destinations, and had to implement a number of these security policies and programs, I did not consider myself fully knowledgeable to implement this at a global scale for a company that was rapidly expanding. And I thought bringing on board an expert who could bring some depth and skill to this particular implementation was a critical piece of, or would be a critical piece of success. A couple of things also happened that really helped, how should I say, clarify my position and influence the thinking around the company. So we have a field office in Thailand, and which was very close to the site of the bombings that happened about a year or so ago. And then we also had a team that was conducting sort of like a debrief in a hotel that was 2 blocks down from the incident where we had the Jakarta shooting incident, the mass shooting incident a couple of years ago as well. Additionally, the founder of the organization decided to make a strategic and concerted effort for us to do more work in what we consider non-permissive environments. And so picking up these nuggets of information from different parts of the company and also living through the Thailand and Jakarta bombings allowed me to put together a very concise business case to my boss, and then essentially lay out what needed to happen in conjunction with the expert that we brought on board to improve our safety and security system. So a couple of very quick things that I wanted to talk about that came out of that is essentially the robust travel program. So given how important a role travel played in the organization from a number of perspectives, right? Because you're selling this to people as, here's how we're going to protect the organization and here's how we're going to improve our bottom line. From a revenue perspective, travel was a massive generator of revenue for us because it is primarily how we did a lot of our work. So if you're speaking to people who care about the revenue argument, then it makes complete sense that if you want to protect your revenue, then I need your buy-in to ensure that we have a secure travel, a robust travel program. Then there's obviously your HR team who have the concern and well-being of staff at play. And then, individuals around sort of people funding IT and challenges that come with information and data management, because what we do is essentially gather data, making sure that that data is secure. And in some cases where you have people collecting information around democracy and governance programs, et cetera, there's a need to ensure that that data is protected. And our staff are too, when they're doing it in an environment where that sort of information may not be viewed upon favorably. Another sort of offshoot of our review was just sort of looking at our general insurance portfolio and calibrating that with what our risk exposure was. So, when the company began, there were certain policies that were purchased to respond to the needs at that time. And there hadn't really been a concerted effort to review what those policies looked like and how they had been adjusted to meet the needs and challenges that we were currently experiencing as an organization. And so we did a couple of things there. We figured out a way to centralize the policies as opposed to having them split across 3 people or 4 people. We just had them sent between two departments or divisions so that the HR piece could just handle everything that was DBA and workman's comp related, and everything else that had to do with corporate or commercial level insurance policies would sit within my division. And then ensure that we work with our broker, which we also had to change as part of this review, to essentially synchronize or harmonize review dates. Because it's important that, there was a logic previously that was applied to the fact that having different insurance policy review dates or renewal dates would force us to review these policies on a more consistent basis. But what it was doing was it was actually making it a little bit more challenging from an administrative perspective, and forcing people to put that off because of the frequency of meetings that had to happen to sit and actually review these pretty much every quarter or every other month. So by centralizing, the renewal schedule, and then just setting regular meetings among the individuals that needed to discuss the different facets of the policies, we were able to adopt a much more sort of a less administratively onerous approach to managing our insurance policies, but a more consistent approach to ensuring that we were reviewing them on a regular basis. Another really important development in all of this, obviously, is around policies and procedures. First of all, putting together a robust travel policies and procedures document, and then training staff to obviously know where to find it, how to access it. And in this, I just want to say part of my sort of thinking around what to do with policies and procedures was not just about the content, but also presentation. We have a 70% plus millennial population, and so presenting them with a 60-page document of policy and procedures was not going to work. So looking at a way to set up the document so that different pages were accessible from any page, setting up links with a menu, simple menu on the side of each page that took people to the specific section that they needed to go to at any point in time without having them scroll through all 60 pages to get to the last point, was a really useful piece or sort of approach or strategy to ensure that the usability of that document would be at an appreciable level. But most importantly, what we did was to tie all that up with a standard of business and ethical conduct document that really laid out sort of core principles around expectations, around the areas that individuals would be held accountable for, behaviors that people needed to exhibit, to be considered essentially compliant and or essentially just doing their jobs, was a critical piece in all of this, because it essentially just puts a bow neatly around all your policies and procedures. Training was a huge, huge piece of this. I mean, I remember in my days coming up in the NGO industry, I was sort of told, you're just got to figure it out or you're going to sink. These days, there's a sort of a much more evolved realization around training with organizations like Humentum providing resources to do that. But then also, equally importantly, organizations internally dedicating or trying to find the space to ensure that you are able to provide training to staff around these policies, procedures, et cetera, as part of your strategy for rolling them out. So we have in place a pretty robust training program that we sort of, we put in place twice a year, covering a range of topics around sort of what we call the project life cycle. So right from inception all the way down to closeout. And then specifically for security, what we try to do is consider every opportunity where you have a person booking a trip or traveling to a particular country as a training opportunity, because they have to undergo a pre-departure briefing. And in this briefing, where you're making them aware of the risks that they're going to face and sort of the mitigating strategies that they ought to put in place, you're also effectively, through repetition, equipping them with the skills that they need to be able to traverse these environments successfully. I just want to touch on a couple of very quick points that Michael raised around sort of, the whole duty of care concept. So that duty of care piece, while it had been understood pretty well at Social Impact, at varying levels, was a critical selling point in terms of rallying people around the mission of building a much more robust safety and security program. My first presentation to the working group was on duty of care, and specifically chronicling case studies where organizations who had found themselves in a position where they hadn't been considered or had been considered negligent, had suffered certain penalties. And that very quickly got people's attention, and then sort of taking it to the next level of helping people identify areas where these risks may be prevalent or where we may not be compliant, helped to drive home the point to individuals who don't live this on a day-to-day basis and the executive suite about the importance and criticality of really observing sort of strong duty of care protocols to your staff. One of the other things that I quickly wanted to touch on was also just the concept of general enterprise risk management. What began when I joined as just a simple need to improve and ensure accountability around travel, safety, and security generated or became a much more larger conversation around enterprise risk management. Because one of the things that I insisted on doing right from the get-go was being integrated into the business development process. So as opposed to sitting at my desk and then at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, somebody showing up and saying Project X is, embarking on a visit to this country, and all of a sudden we just realized that we have no vehicles that are equipped to safely transport our staff from point A to point B. I wanted to just head that off at the pass, so to speak. And so what we would do is ensure that we're on the listserv for all business development proposals coming out, so we knew what proposals we were working on, that we were included in decisions around bid, no bid, so that we can inform those conversations with sort of educated risk analyses. And then in addition to that, be a part of the proposal writing team and build in key risk mitigating measures as part of our program implementation strategy. Because again, when people sort of got their backs up around, risk driving the conversation as opposed to impact, the point was very simple. Listen, I'm not here to stop you from doing your work. I'm here to enable you to do your work and to do it in a way that ensures that we have maximum impact without any sort of liability issues or losses that could mar the great outcomes that we're out there achieving. So essentially just ensuring that we were part of that business development process and being proactive about including costs and working with teams to figure out how to just build costs into budgets so that it isn't really about a separate line item that speaks glaringly to the need for a bunch of sat phones, but that your communications equipment is clearly delineated to include that where permissible, because some countries don't allow it, and then where that doesn't, where you don't have that luxury, what mitigating strategies you can put in place to ensure that you can still get the utility that you need or you would have gained from a SAT device. So, I mean, those are some of the things that we did critically to help move the conversation and to get teams thinking more proactively about safety and security, and ensuring that right from the get-go, it's a part of the conversation and not necessarily an afterthought as we're in the thick of things, so to speak. As far as what we're looking at right now, sort of recently, IT became a part of my portfolio as part of that whole enterprise risk management argument. And so we're looking to build on existing policies and procedures and equip staff with tools that will help facilitate their own abilities to mitigate risks. We have also essentially found ways to integrate just core safety and security concepts into day-to-day standard operations. So instead of, for example, having a separate document dedicated to safety and security, we try to build, for example, safety, what a standard kit should look like for a vehicle into our vehicle policy. Or if it's about how we travel or move, protocols around movement, the types of vehicles or approved forms of travel, et cetera, would just be integrated into that project document as opposed to having it be a separate thing that people need to refer to in order to be able to comply. We also try to just get as much feedback as we can from staff because things don't always go as you expect them to, and things could always be improved. And so creating feedback loops and opportunities for staff to be able to pass on information, which oftentimes helps supplement or augment what we get from our providers, right? So a quick example was a staff member traveling in Bangladesh came back to me and said, oh my goodness, people drive really fast in Bangladesh, and seatbelt use is not really a thing. So I know that you talk about that all the time, but what authority do I have to tell the driver to put on his seatbelt or slow down, or to tell my colleagues to do the same thing? And so thinking that this would be something that people were doing and insisting on, this person felt a little bit more junior and their tenure felt like they didn't have the authority to do that. This was a great opportunity to tell them you absolutely do have the authority to do that, and you should insist on that, or just work with us to just change the vendor to make sure that we're selecting a vendor that is actually going to meet our standards. So really making sure that you're getting that feedback from staff is critical. And then finally, just trying to find ways to use technology platforms to make tools and guidance easily accessible to teams. We have a SharePoint site that we are currently looking at how to sort of, redesign to meet those needs and ensure that it's at the fingertips of staff who are out in the field. And then also thinking through connectivity issues that staff may have and looking at devices that may help augment gaps in connectivity when they're sort of deep out in the field doing work, and trying to build those into budgets proactively so that we can get them funded. That was really sort of my sort of overview of how we've done this. I'm happy to take any questions or supplement with any other information that you may have.
Thank you, Nana. That was really interesting. We do have one question for you from the webinar in the minute or so we have left. Questioner is asking, how long did it take for you to implement these changes to your safety and security management program at Social Impact, and with what resources?
It was a great question. Resources, very simple. It was minimal it was zero to minimal, quite frankly. And so, a lot of times change management principles here are pretty important, right? So setting the urgency was a pretty critical piece that helped us get at least some initial components in place. So over a 2-year period, and most of what I'm talking about right now is what we have on the culmination of the 2-year period. But the first 6 months prioritization was on how do we track people to, who are traveling and where they are. So I think important thing to do is to just look at what the scale of what you're trying to do is and break it up into bite-sized chunks. And look at which elements of those chunks correspond with your highest level of risk exposure and greatest opportunity for buy-in among senior leadership, and then try to go that way, but just have a plan and work that plan on a gradual sort of iterative basis.
And thank you. One more question, and some of this might be outside of your personal area of what you're responsible for, but what types of, someone's asking, what types of things have you included on your SharePoint site as it relates to things like grant compliance?
So that's a great question, and that's one more for my colleague from our senior director for grants and contracts. But we just have a simple site called Contracts, which is equipped with all the resources that staff will need to be able to just go about their day-to-day contract administration work. And to that effect, we're constantly coming up with tools to support that, but everything that staff need, for example, guidance on subcontracting, procurement rules, budgeting guidelines, templates, et cetera, are all sort of present on that particular site within SharePoint.
Thank you, Nana. And thank you to Nana, Jean-Michel, and Michael for a terrific presentation. And thank you to Humentum for being such a great partner and co-sponsoring this program with us. Thank you, Marie. Appreciate all you guys coming. Hope to see you back here next month, December 5th, for our last program of the year. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.